writer for Business Insider, found out that in total, during the 2008 financial crisis, America lost $10.2 trillion. Today, I'm going to be going over the 2008 financial crisis, otherwise known as the Great Recession. I've spent many hours delving into the statistics and the overall occurrences throughout the 2008 financial crisis. I've consulted with financial advisors and even a few stockbrokers. I've watched several films such as The Big Short and Too Big to Fail to help further my knowledge from a different point of view. The 2008 financial crisis is the worst crisis since the Great Depression and also the worst by far in the 21st century. First, I'm going to be talking about the events that led up to this Great Recession. Then I'm going to be going over everything that was going on throughout it and how we tried to stop it, and then the absolute fallout throughout the recession. There are a multitude of reasons why this crisis occurred, but the main one, of course, is the mismanagement and the laziness of those CEOs at the top. According to financial report of the National Commission and the cause of the financial and economic crisis of the United States, between 2001 and 2007, mortgages and their overall costs doubled throughout that 6 years, as opposed to the entire history of our country. In 6 years, it doubled. Banks gave ninja loans to those who had no income whatsoever. That's what a ninja loan is. They knew they'd never be able to pay these loans off, but banks, their mindset was always, well, who would never pay their mortgage? Sooner or later, they found out that people really could not pay their mortgages, and they started defaulting, and they would lose millions and millions because everyone could not pay. They'd even do jumbo loans, which is basically when people wanted to buy a mansion, say in California, Texas, or Florida. And people, once again, they barely had any money, yet they do these jumbo loans with absolutely absurd interest rates, so they could have these mansions for, say, 3-4 years before everyone, once again, started not being able to pay. A 2013 suit by the Justice Department found that in Bank of America, 40% of mortgages and loans did not reach the standard by which they had mortgages done. People could not afford to pay these mortgages because they had no money, no sources of income. But rather than adhere to their preset rules and guidelines, they decided to be greedy and try and get this money through any means possible. Ratings agencies also gave way to many illegal acts and defrauding basically everyone in the entire country. These ratings agencies would give bonds that are triple B, double B, and B, which are very risky and not likely to produce any money whatsoever, and they would rate them triple A. Triple A is the best bonds. They are very safe and very reliable. But because they were doing these false ratings, then people were getting misled and losing millions and millions. These ratings agencies would lie because big banks such as Bear Stearns, they would go to these rating agencies, and if they did not give them the ratings they wanted, they would simply just go to another ratings agency just down the street. And then they'd lose that money from Bear Stearns. So they were encouraged to basically lie and defraud other working class people about these bonds. And when millions stopped paying their mortgages because of these bonds or these loans that they were taking out, then everything started hitting the fan. The events that occurred throughout the crisis were far more extreme than anyone could realize. The amount lost during the Great Recession tripled anything that had been lost in 30 years prior. The crisis was the worst U.S. disaster since the Great Depression. Unemployment rose all the way to 10%, and as before, it was down to 3%. George Bush even had to sign a passage in the U.S. law and doctrine for $700 billion worth of bailout money. This was done so that the Great Recession did not keep growing into something far more terrible and worse. This money was given to the upper banks, although they were mismanaged. Millions of people had their money invested into it, so if these banks went bankrupt, millions upon millions would lose all of their money, and the United States would basically just go into a complete shock, and no one would basically have any money. And not only would it affect the U.S., but the entire world would be affected as well, the entire economy. They would also pay, this bailout money also paid for risky mortgages, auto loans, and college loans that people could not afford to pay since they obviously had ran out of money. Following the 2008 recession, we're still feeling this pain. Unemployment, as I said before, was at 10%. Although it is going down slowly, it is still not down to the 3% as it was before. $10.2 trillion has been lost, and millions of people have lost their homes, and they still have not been able to fully recover. Although we were putting up a good fight, the Dow Jones has risen since the 2008 recession every single year like clockwork. So we are putting up a good fight, and banks are slowly coming back. But if you look through the cracks, you can still find that banks are still greedy as ever. According to the Federal Reserve Bank of San Francisco, you will find that throughout a person's life, they will now make $70,000 less than they would have before the 2008 recession. I've gone over with you the 2008 financial crisis, the Great Recession. I have gone over how banks mismanaged their companies and how they were greedy. I've talked about how George Bush had to do a $700 billion bailout bill, and I've talked to you about how unemployment is still higher than it was before. This speech has been done over the corruption of banks and how it led to the 2008 Great Recession. Do not sit idly by and simply trust those above you about making correct and moral decisions. Be awake, be alert, and be aware that people will cheat you, so you have to be smart and aware. Thank you.
Good job. Give him a hand.